There's a classic rock and roll song first recorded in 1955 by Big Joe Turner. It was later covered by the Blues Brothers, and Ellis Hall's version ended up on the Chicken Run soundtrack, and that song is called Flip, Flop and Fly. Now bear with me here because this is actually going somewhere. 44 years after that song was first recorded, there were some racing cars that were doing their own flipping, flopping and flying, pulling off some backflips that would make Max Whitlock go, not bad. Not bad at all. And the most famous of these cars was the Mercedes CLR at Le Mans. But how did this absolute goldmine of late 90s racing car memes do what it was doing and make every highlight reel for eternity? And the clip of one of the crashes was actually used in the intro to a TV game show over here. Well, it was like a late night TV game show because it was quite rude, called They Think It's All Over, a sports-based quiz show with sporting and celebrity guests on the panel. And that was probably a lot of people's first sort of introduction to this, well, we'll call it a thing. But the thing is, the Mercedes wasn't the only car to do a backflip. There was a car before it, and they didn't really seem to pay any attention until Mercedes started doing it, because the Mercedes ones were pretty big. At that time, there was a class of car known as LMGTP, which stands for Le Mans GT Prototype, and these cars were production road cars turned up to 11. They were in that overlap category of how they were too advanced to be GTs, or GT1 in this case, and not in full compliance with LMP1 that came into effect in 1994. In 1999 though, LMP2 was ditched to allow for these LMGTPs to race, and if we're going to compare them to cars that are knocking around currently, the best thing to compare them to is probably what they're using in Super GT over in Japan, or the 2020 DTM cars, which were, well, actually they were the same class, weren't they? But either way, they were road cars turned up to 11 with a lot of power and a lot of grip. And it has to be said that this category was brought in pretty much because of Mercedes, but we'll get to that in a bit. The previous year though, in 1998, the ACO, who are the organisers of Le Mans, had allowed the formation of the American Le Mans Series, or ALMS, which was to replace the now defunct IMSA GT Championship and would allow the same class structure that they were using here in Europe, with the ACO licensing the Le Mans name and allowing the use of Le Mans prototype classes in North America. Also in 1998 came the first ever Petite Le Mans race, 10 hours of racing around Road Atlanta, which I have to say is one of my favourite tracks in the world, and maybe I should attempt the iRacing one this year if I can get around to doing it. Now this race saw one of the first instances of what we'd later see at Le Mans as a Porsche 911 GT driven by Yannick Dalmas came over the crest on the back straight and flipped over. Moving on into 99, however, and this LMGTP class was going ahead for Le Mans, and there were a couple of these road cars turned up to 11 taking part, such as the aforementioned CLR and the Audi R8C. There was also the Toyota GT1, but that resembled more of an LMP2 than it did an actual road car. The reason for developing this thing was because GT1 was now dead. Mercedes had absolutely obliterated the 1998 GT1 Championship with the CLK, and the other manufacturers had decided to not bother showing up because, well, Mercedes was too good and the costs were getting out of control. So with no GT1 class for 1999, Mercedes needed something else to do, and so did the ACO. And thanks to the ACO's creation of LMGTP, it meant they could basically take the blueprint of the existing GT1 and go absolutely mad with it, given that there were no requirements to build road-going versions of the car like before. As a result, the car was lighter, 50 kilograms or 90 pounds lighter in fact, and was able to have a smaller cockpit made out of carbon fibre and aluminium to make it pass the ACO's crash tests. They also made it about 4 inches shorter and were able to extract everything they could from the front end aero by making the nose lower, and made the thing as sleek as possible because, well, it's Le Mans and top speed is the name of the game for a good chunk of the lap. The engine was a 5.7 litre V8 that chucked out about 600 horsepower, more than enough for the Mulsanne. And the drivers involved in the project and would be going to Le Mans were well-known names in motorsport: Bernd Schneider, Nick Heidfeld, Jean-Marc Gounon, Pedro Lamy, Peter Dumbreck, and some Aussie kid called Mark Webber. Schneider would be a 5-time DTM champion, Heidfeld was an up-and-coming talent, Gounon is the father of Jules Gounon, Pedro Lamy already had GT pedigree and 2 class podiums to his name at Le Mans already, and Mark Webber was Mark Webber. But because Mercedes had wiped the floor with everybody in GT1 the previous year, they got a free pass to Le Mans. Well, for one car they did anyway. The other 2 cars would have to pre-qualify like everybody else, and the plan was to initially enter 4 cars and then do some of the ALMS races at places like Las Vegas, Petit Le Mans, and also at Laguna Seca. But while in qualifying for the race, the first accident happened. While on the flat-out run from Mulsanne Corner to Indianapolis, Webber was following one of the Audis ahead of him when the car just decided, "I must go now, my planet needs me," and then took off. It did a full backflip and then landed awkwardly before skidding to a halt in the Armco. Given that this was 1999 and there wasn't the all-access TV stuff we get today, this accident wasn't caught on camera. But then in the warm-up, Webber was involved in pretty much the same accident, this time on the run into Mulsanne Corner. Once again, he was in the slipstream of the other two Mercs, where once again his CLR lifted up and did another backflip, reaching an estimated 30 feet or 9 meters into the air. This time though, he skidded on his roof to a stop in the Mulsanne Corner runoff area. There are a million clips of it on YouTube. I was going to license a picture, but it was £375. It's cheaper for you to Google it. Webber's car had to be withdrawn. They had managed to do a rebuild job on it after the first accident, but after this one there just wasn't enough time to get the car ready for the race. So only 2 cars would start the actual race. Speaking of the race though, 4 hours in, Dumbreck made contact with one of the Porsches but didn't seem to have any damage. But as it went up the run from Mulsanne to Indianapolis, Dumbreck would have one of the most heart-stopping accidents in Le Mans history. His car also got air. It also flipped, and unlike Webber, he actually ended up on the other side of the Armco and landed in the trees. And luckily for Dumbreck, the place he landed in used to have trees until 2 weeks before the race, so he got extremely lucky to just be briefly knocked out. It's also this accident that everybody thinks was Webber, but it wasn't Webber, it was Dumbreck. To add insult to injury, Dumbreck had to then be breathalyzed by the local gendarme, which is French for the Rozzers, because the accident had taken place on French public roads. But despite being knocked out, he was totally fine and was able to, walk out of the hospital a little bit later on. So what happened then? Well, this is all part of how the cars of this era were being designed. While Formula 1 5 years prior had started to run away from flat-bottom car designs, sports cars were still using them. The design was particularly useful for Le Mans, where top speed was key, so they were built this way to run as low to the ground as possible and maximise top speed. And while Formula 1 cars typically run some rake angle, so having the front end of the car lower than the rear to help the car generate some turn-in, the cars used by BMW, Porsche and Mercedes at Le Mans were running a much more neutral ride height balance, again, for top speed. The problem is, once the Mercs were cresting those rises on the straight, that neutral pitch became an ever so slightly upward one, so there would suddenly be a huge pocket of air under the front of the car where there shouldn't be one. Once that reached a certain point, there would be way more downforce at the rear compared to the front, and at that point, you're not fighting physics anymore, and the car just looped. I don't know if you were like me on Gran Turismo 3, taking the Escudo Pikes Peak and making it pop a wheelie at any given opportunity, and the thing is, it also only took about 2.4 degrees of upward pitch before the Mercedes reached the point of no return. But in response, the ACO decided to take measures to make sure this sort of thing didn't happen again. They mandated dive planes on the cars to keep the noses down. They flattened some of the humps in the track, which is similar to how they flattened Flugplatz or whatever that hump is called on the Nürburgring, which was flattened after a similar accident occurred involving Jan Mardenborough's Nissan GTR. 23 years on, there hasn't been a copycat accident since, so it appears that they've managed to get the problem fixed. But still, that footage of the CLR performing backflips at Le Mans will forever be part of motorsport legend. So that there then is the story of how the Mercedes CLR went full Simone Biles at Le Mans. If you've learned something new here today, then be sure to like the video, and if you're not already, get subscribed and also get that bell on as well, so you never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks to the good folk of Patreon for their continued support, and if you want to help support the channel at a more personal level, you can do so by following the link in the description, where there'll also be directions to Discord and also to my socials. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a cracking day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.